How Heisenberg Survived the DEA. As a middle-aged man suffering from a supposedly chronic illness, Walter White showed scary levels of competence as his drug lord persona, Heisenberg. Not only was he able to build a drug empire from scratch in well under a year, but he was able to avoid arrest for nearly 2 years. Considering how the DEA was always in his close vicinity, and the fact that his brother-in-law is a DEA agent, it's interesting to notice that Walter wasn't caught sooner. Looking back at his conduct and demeanor throughout the series, it's not like he was particularly careful or organized either. There were times when he was brash, impulsive, and reckless. However, up until the very end of the series, the authorities never quite could identify him as the man they had been looking for. Even at the end, when Walter White was correctly identified and caught, he went down on his own terms, ensuring his death right before the boys in blue arrived for his arrest. What was it about Walt that enabled him to stay ever so elusive through the entirety of the series? In this video, I'm going to take a look at how Heisenberg managed to fend off the DEA for so long, what that says about Walt's character, and how this kind of dynamic has been used to create tension in different kinds of media. For the majority of Breaking Bad, Walter White employed only one method to keep himself safe: hiding in plain sight. To Walt, this method came naturally. This is mostly due to the kind of person he was before he got into the drug business. Walt's persona was inoffensive and unassuming. He was a 50-year-old high school teacher with a part-time gig at a car wash that struggled to financially provide for his family. Walter's life was mediocre and mundane. However, these pitiful attributes that Walt had come to resent were invaluable once he started his midlife crisis-prompted hobby of meth cooking. It provided him with the perfect disguise, albeit one that might not be entirely intentional. Furthermore, the way society had treated Walt up until that point in time became another veil of his disguise. From the way Walter was treated in the car wash, we could tell at least partially how society supposedly saw Walt and what kind of person he was. All of these factors added up to a very potent disguise. The best part was, all of it required minimal effort to maintain. For the most part, Walt did not have to change a thing. In order to understand why Walt survived so long and yet was ultimately caught, we need to take a look at another character that shared this method of hiding: Gus Fring. Like Walt, Gus preferred to hide his unlawful activities without hiding from the public's eye. He was a known figure in his local community. In fact, he took it one step further and actively made an effort to make himself known. He formed good relations with not just local institutions and foundations, but also the police and the DEA. Gus believed that the best way to conceal his illegal actions was to assume the role of someone the DEA was familiar with. He wanted them to rule him out as a culprit before they even started their investigation. It was this fact that Walter latched onto and eventually made him able to identify Gus in Los Polos Hermanos. Game recognizes game, or so Walt thought. He understood what Gus was doing and felt like he had found a kindred spirit. However, as Gus correctly surmised, they weren't as alike as Walt thought. This difference was immediately felt by Gus the moment he identified Jesse, who was high when he showed up as Walt's partner. We can imagine what Gus would perhaps be thinking from witnessing this phenomenon. He thought that Walt was either incompetent or emotional. If Walt were simply not aware of how Jesse behaved and didn't see how he could be dangerous for their business operations, then he was simply not good enough for Gus to do business with. On the other hand, if Walt knew well enough that Jesse was problematic, yet kept him around anyway, that spoke of an emotional bond between the two of them, in which case, Gus could rule Walt out for bringing personal feelings into his business dealings. If these were his thoughts, then Gus was right on the money. The first fundamental difference between the two of them, in this context, was that while Gus was a complete professional, Heisenberg had an emotionally driven ego. When Gus further asked why Walt kept Jesse around, he simply told him that Jesse listened to what he said. Of course, what Walt truly meant was that Jesse validated his ego due to his general incompetence and yet managed to be useful enough to Walt as he entered this new world of crime he previously knew nothing about. Although it was true that Gus was vengeful, perhaps even more so than Walt, he was able to keep his personal emotions in check to the extent that he could during business dealings. Gus was neither arrogant nor prideful. He was a professional and a good businessman. Walt was neither of these things. Heisenberg progressively failed more and more to keep his bumbling ego in check. He couldn't bear the fact that his family was given what he perceived to be pity money by his ex-business partner. He couldn't stand that Saul was going to frame his drug money as pitiful donations from random strangers. And he wouldn't let Hank end his Heisenberg search with a faulty conclusion, something that was objectively great for what Walt was trying to do. Now, having elaborated on the multiple ways Walt threatened his own safety solely because of his inflated ego, why couldn't Hank realize it sooner? Surely, if Walt was so insistent in jeopardizing himself, Hank, being a competent DEA agent, would quickly figure it out. This was a testament to how strong of a disguise Walt initially had. Although partially unintentional, as we had mentioned before, Walt had formulated the perfect disguise for his criminal activities. It just so happened that this specific facade was particularly effective to Hank, someone who knew Walt very well. Although Hank did love Walt and wanted what was best for him, he could not help but see Walt as a failure, a wasted potential. Hank's less than favorable judgments of Walt immediately ruled him out of the list of suspects. This was exactly what Gus aimed to do by forming good relationships with his local communities. Walt managed to do it by virtue of just being his mediocre self. Throughout the series, not once did Hank suspect Walt to be the drug lord kingpin Heisenberg. He was open to Walt about his investigation and even had Walt help him out with certain things. Walt had a perfect hand, but when Hank eventually gave up, chalking Heisenberg to probably be the then-dead Gale, Walt simply could not let that go. His ego took over, and he encouraged Hank to keep looking because there was no way that Gale could be anywhere near as good as the great Heisenberg. The cat-and-mouse dynamic utilized by Vince Gilligan for Walter and Hank is nothing new to fictional media. It is a tried-and-true trope that raises the stake and tension of the show by pairing up the hero and the villain in close, generally friendly proximity. This dynamic works because character A does not know who character B truly is, and character B does everything in his power to keep it that way. When done well, it has the potential to give rise to strong rivalries. The conclusion of these relationships is usually never happy, since ultimately the secrets are revealed, and the pairing could no longer act out the pretense of friendship, even when it might have been real for one, if not both sides of the relationship. The execution is also key, because while the characters might have had conflicting interests, the bond they share is usually real to an extent. Not to mention, they might have grown to be the audience's favorite duo for that particular show. Breaking Bad did this brilliantly with Walt and Hank. Until the moment of Hank's death, the audience is brought along on their emotional roller coaster of love, hate, and betrayal. The ultimate downfall of Heisenberg was caused by a lot of things. However, you can make a strong argument that, at the end of the day, it was Walt's own undoing that brought him his demise. His attempt to hide in plain sight gave him a very strong start, even stronger than Gus Fring, who was arguably more organized and calculating than Walt could ever be. This bought Walt some time, but his ego eventually couldn't take it anymore. Walt's unwillingness to accept Hank's faulty conclusion of who Heisenberg was led him to not only the end of his prized drug empire, but also the death of one of the people he cared for the most.